Welcome back to this series introducing Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. This is the 14th and final part of our introduction, and it continues Dooyeweerd's discussion of sociology. We have seen how humanism claimed to approach a theory of social reality based on an unbiased account of the social facts themselves. This meant that sociology, from its beginning, failed to even formulate its basic problems properly. However, many contemporary sociologists, Dooyeweerd discusses, reject the task to formulate such problems. As an empirical science, they claim they must detach themselves from the illusion that they must first delimit their respective fields of research in an a priori fashion. This is an impossible task imposed by philosophy. Instead, sociology must make its own way, and only later, after proper progress has been made, can philosophical reflection begin. Dooyeweerd notes that this reasoning seems attractive, but he aims a number of criticisms against it. In particular, it takes an uncritical view of the social facts, assuming that they are objectively present to us as data, independent of all norms and standards of evaluation. This is not the true state of affairs, as sociology developed from the classical ideal of science to the historical ideal, both determined by the humanistic ground motive. In neither case, therefore, Dooyeweerd writes, could one speak of a presuppositionless, unbiased scientific methodology. Both ideals dictated the need, as a matter of principle, to eliminate all those constant structures of society grounded in the order of creation, which in fact make possible our experience of the variable social phenomenon. Dooyeweerd rejects this approach, as societal relations always presuppose norms, and without which such relations simply cannot exist. What does Dooyeweerd mean by these norms, and how are they related to constant structures of society? Later he talks about the dual structure of reality, which concerns his distinction between modal structures and typical totality structures. It will be helpful to understand this. We can simplify a little and think of typical totality structures as entities or things, such as a bird's nest, which is Dooyeweerd's example he discusses later, and which have a vertical structure. And then the modal aspects as ways things exist, their physical aspect, aspect of organic life, psychical aspect, logical aspect, historical aspect, and so on. Everything exists according to the horizontal structures of the modal aspects, but as individual things, they function within those aspects in typical or unique ways. With this in the background, we can now appreciate Dooyeweerd's point. He argues that if sociology wants to undertake an empirical investigation into marital relations in different societies, for example, then there will need to be an understanding of how marriage functions in typical ways that distinguish it from concubinage or other extramarital sexual relations. Without this, there can be no empirical investigation, and this requires a normative understanding of marriage. This means that part of what the very meaning or nature of marriage is implies certain recognized norms, even if they are not in actual fact adhered to. The same point applies to an investigation of the nature of the state from a sociological point of view. Dooyeweerd writes, anyone who discusses monarchy, parliament, ministers, etc., is concerned with social realities which cannot be experienced as such unless one takes into account their authority or competence. Dooyeweerd acknowledges that authority and legal competence are essentially normative states of affairs, which presuppose the validity of social norms. As such, they cannot be perceived by the senses. The same is true of social classes, which depends on notions such as ownership, which rest on legal norms, or means of production, which can be recognized only on the basis of economic norms. Dooyeweerd asks, what social facts then would be left if we took seriously the dogma that sociology must suspend all norms and standards of evaluation? Dooyeweerd goes on to consider the counter-argument that a gang of robbers is no less a legitimate subject of sociological investigation because it fails to meet certain norms. To this, Dooyeweerd replies that such a study really must take into account the distinction between a criminal and a non-criminal organization. Otherwise, he says, I truly would not know how one could manage to investigate sociologically a gang of robbers and not perhaps mistakenly honour a charitable organisation, a church, or a state with one's attention as a scientist. Without such normative criteria, it would be impossible to tell the difference. Another counter-argument is that social norms can themselves be the subject of sociological investigation and so treated as factual states of affairs arising out of social circumstances of a non-normative character. On this basis, a factual regularity can over time acquire a feeling of social ought. Dooyeweerd rejects this explanation because such regularity is not sufficient to explain a feeling of ought. This can be shown on the basis of a counter-example. No matter how regular or generally accepted such bad habits as stealing from one's employers becomes, this can never generate a social order that brings with it the stigma of being antisocial. To develop this, we could say that no one strengthens themselves against temptations and puts effort to steal from their employers, thinking, well, I really ought to steal. This is because, as Dooyeweerd puts it, only authentic social norms which order societal relationships in a truly lasting manner can, when they are followed, bring about a feeling of social ought. Now, there seems to be a problem with this claim because it appears to assume that a feeling of ought can never be misplaced, but that seems obviously wrong. We might feel that we ought to follow our superiors' orders, even when we don't fully agree with them. This kind of feeling can lead to disastrous results when our superiors order us to do what is immoral. However, Dooyeweerd need not be committed to such an implausible position because his point is more limited and has to do with explaining a feeling of social ought. In the problematic example, the feeling of ought can be explained on the basis of genuine social norms. One should follow the orders of your superiors. However, like all norms, it is limited in scope and not absolute, and so without exception. The feeling of ought is genuine, however it should be rightly balanced by other normative demands, so that when superiors order what is immoral, the norm to follow orders is overridden by an opposing norm. Dooyeweerd argues that the usual distinction between causal explanation and normative evaluation is deeply rooted in the religious ground motive of nature and freedom. This is because causal explanation was understood in terms of the deterministic character of classical physics, and so left no room for the autonomous freedom of human personality. In their attempt to unite the science ideal with the universalistic view of historicism, Saint-Simon and Comte ended up in an antinomy. The first element led to an individualistic view of society, while the second attempted to understand all social relations as individual parts of an individual whole, which led to a rejection of the natural scientific view of causality. Dooyeweerd now sketches a number of shifts in sociology that illustrate this alternating influence of the humanistic nature motive versus the freedom motive. First, there was a more rationalistic approach developing out of the idea of the biological cell and the new evolutionistic way of thinking, which both broke things down to their component elements. Later, with the development of modern psychology, there developed an emphasis on human action as irreducible to mechanical causation, and this was reinforced by a resurgence of a Kantian critical philosophy, which limits the role of natural scientific thought. Then there came the effects of the revolution in 20th century physics, which broke with mechanistic notions of causation. At this point, Dooyeweerd writes, irrationalistic historicism, which had detached itself from its spiritual roots in freedom idealism, gained the upper hand everywhere. In this way, the process of the religious uprooting of humanism was set in motion. After this brief historical interlude, Dooyeweerd returns to the problem of causality. He argues that for this concept to be scientifically usable, it requires above all a possibility for comparison between cause and effect. It must be possible to subsume cause and effect under a single denominator. This was possible within classical physics due to its focus on the aspect of physical motion. Dooyeweerd argues that the situation is quite different when an attempt is made to establish a causal nexus between the physico-chemical aspect of phenomena and the aspect of organic life. Such an application of the concept of causation can only make sense on the basis of a materialistic assumption which is inspired by the science ideal and lacks any basis in reality. Dooyeweerd continues his discussion through observing the relevance of the distinction between two structures of reality. This is the difference between entities, which function in all the modal aspects, and the aspects of reality themselves, which cut across concrete entities. We earlier introduced this distinction using the image of vertical lines to represent entities and horizontal lines to represent the modal aspects. Dooyeweerd's point is that clear and well-formulated scientific concepts need to find their home within a particular modal aspect, and this is what makes the kind of abstract analysis necessary for scientific study possible. It is Dooyeweerd's view that because these modal aspects are mutually irreducible, it is therefore impossible that they should stand in mutual relations of cause and effect to one another. As examples, Dooyeweerd considers possible claims of sociology to find that the legal order has its cause in a feeling for justice, or that economic valuations are caused by feelings of pleasure and pain. Cause and effect must be understood to fall under a common denominator in order for them to be understood to have a lawful relation. Therefore, Dooyeweerd concludes, no scientific explanation is offered at all when one tried to establish a causal connection between the various aspects distinguishable in reality. For here we are concerned with aspects of reality which do not, in a scientific sense, admit of any comparison. An objection to this view is that we do in fact experience just the kind of causal interaction that Dooyeweerd seems to consider impossible. Dooyeweerd gives the example of someone being killed by lightning or poison. Do we not find here a causal connection between purely physical and chemical processes and the phenomena of organic life? His response is that in these examples, we are confronting concrete reality in all its many-sided richness and coherence. We do not discover any purely physical or chemical reality, nor any purely organic reality with which it might interact. In the non-scientific experience of our daily lives, we perceive and grasp things and events in their concrete reality, and there they function in all aspects without exception. This means that lightning and poison as concrete realities cannot be reduced to their physical and chemical aspect. This may seem like a surprising claim. After all, these substances by themselves do not possess organic life or a faculty of feeling or logical thinking. Dooyeweerd challenges us to think through this objection and put it to the test. He takes the example of a bird's nest. Here we have an entity that only functions actively in the first 5 modal aspects. Nevertheless, we are dealing with an animal product which fulfills a typical function in a bird's life. This shows that an essential element of a bird's nest is its functioning within the organic modal aspect as the habitat for the bird. If we give an exclusively physical-chemical analysis, we must disregard this essential feature, and so the bird's nest as such vanishes from our view. We are left with nothing but a scientific abstraction. The same is true for a poison. It is only a poison in relation to a living thing. Dooyeweerd calls this a subject-object relation. The poison functions passively as an object in the organic aspect, and this gets realized in relation to a living thing that functions actively in the organic aspect, and so as a subject. Many examples can be given of inorganic things that play a role in society. Houses, offices, factories, museums, streets, highways, automobiles, trains, aeroplanes, etc. only have real existence in a subject-object relation within society. Without exception, they function in all aspects of reality. Dooyeweerd's contention is that sociology can only be successfully developed through an acknowledgement and investigation into these structures. With its religious ground motive, modern humanism has banished such structures from its perspective, and so there is a need for the slow and patient work of developing a Christian sociology inspired by the Christian ground motive. The humanistic ideal of science depended throughout upon humankind's faith in its own autonomy, understood in characteristic humanistic fashion. This faith could not tolerate the acceptance of a creation order to which individuals, quite independently of their own subjective thinking and volition, a subject. This meant that sociology began immediately to eliminate the modal structures of the aspects, and through that it could grasp the empirical reality of society apart from its underlying structural matrix. Dooyeweerd considers the task of sociology to bring together all the perspectives developed by the modally specific sciences in a typical, comprehensive theoretical perspective. This requires a philosophical framework that cannot be brushed aside in favour of a purely empirical approach. The question of how we are to understand the empirical character of the reality of social relationships is itself a philosophical question. We must recognize that the typical structures of marriage, family, state, church, etc. are not sensorily perceptible entities presented to us in an objective space of sensory perception. They embrace all modal aspects of reality without exception. To press home this point, Dooyeweerd gives the example of a socio-historical inquiry into the factual development of the life of the state. In order for such an investigation to be successfully accomplished, a number of critical questions need to be answered. Dooyeweerd lists some and points out that these questions cannot be answered on the basis of sense perception alone, but will require the kind of transdisciplinary framework that it is the job of philosophy to provide. Then he considers an alternative solution which appeals to ideal type concepts. He rejects this approach as they ultimately are nothing but subjective constructions which cannot contribute anything to our insight into the typical totality structures of reality. As an example of this kind of construction, he refers to the ideal type Homo economicus, the fantasy image of a person who is driven only and exclusively by personal economic self-interest. Dooyeweerd concludes that the first objective of a Christian sociology must be to acquire insight into the typical totality structures of society and into the different ways these structures are mutually intertwined. This is where Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture ends. If you're interested in seeing how these ideas get developed further, you could read A Christian Theory of Social Institutions by Dooyeweerd, which develops his sociological thinking. You might also be interested in the Twilight of Western Thought, which in chapters 3 and 4 also continue his analysis of historicism. An excellent introduction to Herman Dooyeweerd's thought is by Jonathan Chaplin, subtitled Christian Philosopher of State and Civil Society. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Roots of Western Culture and continue to read Dooyeweerd's works.